And the third and final part of our study of religion anthropologically is we want to take a look at some of the early theories of religion. Anthropology itself began with individuals who looked again at some of the travel logs and some of the descriptions from various people, including missionaries who traveled the world and looked at various cultures and described them. And out of them came the attempt to try and to develop some type of theory as to how religion came about. And while these theories never actually have answered that question completely, it is instructive to take a look at some of these early theories of religion. We begin with those that we call evolutionary or intellectual cognitive approaches. The idea is that religious beliefs reflects primitive beliefs of people, and primitive meaning early. We don't want to get into the derogatory use of primitive, but primitive meaning early. That's how we define that particular word in this course. That ultimately the idea that religion reflects pre-scientific efforts to explain and predict natural events, things like earthquakes, eclipses, other catastrophes, or even death, those kinds of things that religion, before people had some understanding as to how some of those things happen, this theory maintains that religion rose out of an attempt to explain those things. That it also came from a desire among early humans to make some type of sense and order out of disorder. Why does disease happen? Why do crops sometimes fail despite the best efforts to ensure a successful crop? We begin our look at the evolutionary intellectual cognitive theory of religion with E.B. Tylor. Tylor coined the term animism, that is the belief in many spirits. But Tylor reached that by, first of all, thinking and talking about humans who had a belief in many souls. He explored the idea that when people went to sleep and when we dream, that the places that we travel and the things that we experience in dreams being evidence of the soul, the evidence of many souls. And from that, as individuals departed or died, that belief in souls became belief in spirits. Those souls continued to live on and became spirits, and ultimately moved to the point of being not only spirits, but into the realm of deities. And so the idea of polytheism, or the belief in many deities, is the next phase, according to Tylor, in the evolutionary sequence of religion. And because Tylor, being from an ethnocentric perspective, a part of a culture that saw monotheism being at the top, of course, said that ultimately polytheism made way to monotheism. The next thing we'll look at in the evolutionary intellectual cognitive theory of religion is Fraser's 3 stages of religion. He first begins with magic, that early humans had a belief in magic, and he saw 2 laws of magic, the law of similarity and the law of contagion. We'll go more into those things in our discussion on magic, but the law of similarity is that like produces like, and the law of contagion is that those things that once had contact with something continue to have influence on something. We'll talk about that more. Fraser saw that out of magic then ultimately came religion, as these ideas around magic became more solidified in the minds and the practices of people. Out of that came religion. And ultimately, Fraser saw science, though, as being the final answer to those things that people once were unable to explain, and ultimately predicted, as did the other evolutionary intellectual cognitive theorists that ultimately science would win out and would ultimately be able to provide all of the answers that formerly were only answered by religion. The next phase of religion theory are what are called devolutionary theories. And that is that the idea that at one time the world was in an ideal, pristine state. And out of that came some incident, something that happened where the world began to degenerate from that particular ideal, pristine state and is headed toward an apocalyptic end. Many people are familiar with, for example, the story of the Garden of Eden contained in the Hebrew scriptures, and it has its parallel in some other scriptures, but the idea that humankind once lived in this ideal state, and then out of incidents that happened, things began to come into play that took humankind out of that particular state. And so that's what we call devolutionary theory. Devolutionary theory goes with the idea that time is running out for the world. When we look at devolutionary theories, I want to continue by bringing up one that's really kind of different, somewhat sort of novel, and that is Max Muller, who talks about religion being the result of the disease of language. Muller's idea was that people were initially in awe of natural elements such as lightning, earthquakes, the sun, all of those things, phenomena that happens around us, and began to give names to those things. And over time, those names began to be associated with particular deities. And those deities developed a life of their own. They became anthropomorphic. They had human qualities assigned to them. And then there was sacred stories that developed about those supernatural beings. And then entire religious systems developed around those particular stories, those particular deities and all of that. And then Muller says that as a result of semantic errors, a degenerative series of semantic errors, that religion came about. It's really kind of a novel idea, a lot of times not always easy for people to understand, but I thought it something that I wanted to include in this discussion. We turn to the German Jesuit ethnologists. In their study of culture, they developed the term Kulturkreisläre, and that is, as they looked at various cultures and societies, they posited the idea that the more sophisticated the culture, the more degenerative the faith. That as cultures develop technology and other things, the more and more they found themselves moving away from the ideals and the very basics of a particular faith. Them being Catholics, for example, they saw that, Roman Catholics, they saw that in many of the cultures that they studied, and they advanced the idea that when one looks at the more basic, less sophisticated cultures, where the idea of primitive in their minds was that they oftentimes would have belief in a high God and a simple, moral, natural code as they saw it. We know that, again, this doesn't always play out, doesn't always carry out. The next approach to study of religion are those psychological approaches. And the psychological theory of religion is that religion exists to help reduce anxiety. That when people have a way to explain why misfortunes happen, for example, they can better manage themselves through that. If we think about when things like national tragedies happen, or even tragedies in people's lives, people search for meaning, they search for reasons. Many people may be familiar with the attacks in the United States during 9/11, and how, as a result of that, many people sought to find reasons to explain why this happened. And very often the explanation was a religious one. And out of that, the psychological approach also says that people, by using a ritual, it helps one to better control their response and the reactions to things that happen, and their troubles can be alleviated through the means of a ritual. We move now to social cultural theories and sociological approaches. And the first one says that when we look at a particular society, we'll see the values of that society represented in the religion and the religious institutions of that society. That is done in such a way that those values of society are internalized, and religion helps to reinforce those, help us understand what it means to be a part of a culture, what it means to operate within that culture. And those ideals and ideas are reinforced in the religion of that culture. Finally, we look at religion from behavioral definition, or the fact that rituals, and we'll talk more and more about rituals in this course, but rituals are stereotyped sequences of behavior associated with particular emotions and then being rationalized or made meaningful by the supernatural beliefs of the performers. That religion came about as a result of ritual, that as people saw certain things happen as a result of particular actions and behaviors, they began to associate those ideas with something happening, with particular beliefs, and assigning those beliefs to what would ultimately become religion, and those rituals being at the heart of it. Something that we'll talk about in this course are what are called cultural universals. And religion is one such thing. Religion is a cultural universal. And oftentimes we ask, why is religion a cultural universal? Many people answer this by saying that religion helps us to understand life and death, and that all societies, all cultures have a need to be able to explain those two things that happen for all human beings. And religion serves to provide answers in many different ways. We can think about and we'll explore a lot of the sacred stories and the way in which responsibility for things such as life and death are assigned. Some have theorized that religion is a cultural universal because it's a reversal to childhood, back at a time when people were very trusting, when they saw their destiny and things happening to them outside of themselves and all of that, and religion reflects an example of that. Still others, again, when we're talking about the psychological approach for religion, a part of it being able to reduce anxiety and uncertainty and providing us with rituals and other ways to explain and to deal with those things. And finally, people talk about religion as universal maybe because there's a need for community. And religion in many ways, with the gatherings that we see, helps people to come together, to find commonalities, to find ways in which to cope with things that are happening in the world, but all of that being a part of it. Still another reason for, and these are some newer theories or newer ideas about why religion is universal. First of all, looking at religion because we've been able now to study the brain and look at what's happening in the brain, who have theorized that religion might be a process of the human brain through cognition, that we have experiences and we assign roles to those experiences that are then termed or deemed to be religious, that religious or spiritual experiences are grounded in a shared human biology. The idea that for example, as people approach death, them reporting very similar experiences. People who have what we call near-death experiences, where they might have actually had their heart to stop and they died, so to speak, but then they were revived and came back and will report very similar kinds of things that happened to them as a result of that. And what's been more recently advances the idea that a part of the brain, the front temporal lobe, as being the God module, where scientists who have studied the brain have been able to identify some of those processes happening that ultimately humans identify as religious. Looking at the brains, for example, scanning the brains of people who are devout meditators and them seeing certain processes happening, or again, when we talked about near-death experiences. All of that, which serves again as other answers as to why religion is a cultural universal. This concludes our discussion of the anthropological approach to the study of religion.